Greetings comrades, I'm sorry I haven't produced any videos this last week. I've been working like crazy and my work involves about 3 hours of commuting each day and getting up at 5 AM, so as you can imagine I'm quite tired at the moment. My access to the internet has also been quite limited, so I haven't really been able to keep track of world events as much as I would like to, beyond a copy of the Morning Star on the train to London. Still, today and tomorrow, hopefully I'll make a couple of videos and I'll try and find more time next week. I've also been spending a lot of time frantically devouring a copy of History of the Russian Revolution by Leon Trotsky, which I have to give back to my friend soon, which in addition to being fascinating and as detailed as a book on revolution could hope to be, it's also really fucking long. Still, I recommend discarding any anti-Trotsky hang-ups you might have and giving it a go, because it's a really interesting book. Today's subject is going to be my thoughts on some of the recent saber-rattling by elements of the Western powers against the Islamic Republic of Iran, which have taken a somewhat stomach-churning acuteness recently. And what it basically boils down to is the West's fear that Iran is in the process of building nuclear weapons and that they still might use these capabilities to attack the allies of the West in the region. But let me first, however, give some backstory to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran today is a Shia Islamic theocracy with elements of traditional democracy, which at times are pretty much subverted. If I may oversimplify their governmental system for a moment, it's essentially a system of clerics that have supreme authority in making decisions and important influence over all of the country's politics. They vet individuals such as presidential and governmental candidates for suitability, essentially choosing who the public can choose for elections. The system is somewhat complicated, but I will provide a link to the Wikipedia article for whatever that's worth in the description box. Anyone who is willing to further elaborate in a video response is welcome to do so. What is more my field of interest is how this system actually came about, and for this we must look back to the 1950s. Iran had been ruled by a Shah, or Emperor, who was a pro-Western and secular and totally innocuous to the West's hunger for Iranian resources, most importantly oil, in contrast to the majority of the population who were deeply suspicious of the West and very religious, and greatly influenced by Shia clerics, both politically and culturally. The middle ground was found in a democratically elected prime minister called Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a nationalist, who came into conflict with the West over his policy of nationalising oil companies and putting profits in the hands of the Iranian people and not the West. The world being pretty bipolar at the time, the West feared that should this relationship break down between them and Iran, Iran may look for support in the Soviet Union, whom the West was struggling with in Asia and Europe. Another fear was the increasing popularity of the Communist Tudeh Party of Iran, which was becoming bolder and more insurrectionary in its actions, opposing both the nationalist government, the monarchy, the reactionary clerics and the West, while supporting an alliance with the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc. Iran's resources and geographical position in the world made it a very coveted ally for both the East and West, wishing to stem the tide of Soviet influence. And so the CIA and the MI6 were directed to pacify the increasingly unstable Iranian situation. Now, the Tudeh Party, whose analysis of the situation correctly led them to believe that a coup was likely, stepped up preparations for such an event. And when members within the Iranian military discovered a plot, supporters began rioting and demanding the abolition of the monarchy, which they believed, again correctly, was a strong link between the Iranian power structure and the West. Now, the Prime Minister decided that such instability might just destroy the country and decided to crack down on the Tudeh, who were forced to reverse their preparations. Days later, though, on August 19th, 1953, the Iranian military, with the assistance and encouragement of their CIA and MI6 advisors, deposed Mohammad Mossadegh's government, allowing Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to assume full power. The Shah then banned many political groups, including the former Prime Minister's party, the National Front, I believe they were called, and the Tudor Party, who then went underground. And with the help of Western intelligence, the party was basically decimated over the next few years, including their network within the military. Now, subsequent analysis by the party has shown that the network was in a position to arm Tudor supporters and workers, though how much help that might have been against the reactionary military is subject to speculation. Now, at a conference in Moscow in 1957, the remaining party members decided that opposing the Mossadegh government at the time, when the country was vulnerable to subversion by Western imperialism, was incorrect. I'll leave that to you to make a judgment on that. I don't really have much of an opinion. Iran at the time was still quite backwards compared to the West and the Eastern Bloc, with religious clerics holding great sway over the population and many elements of feudalism still intact. The Shah's government was interested in developing Iran into a modern bourgeois society with an autocracy, allied of course to the West, and would probably need to overthrow the feudal, at least in word if not in deed, and religious elements of society in order to do this. Rather kind of suppress the religious elements. And thus began the White Revolution, a program of land reforms, privatisation, social welfare, and just general modernisations of industry and culture aimed at building a secular Western-style industrial power, as well as an attempt to gain support from the peasants and the workers by giving them land and profit sharing, as well as disadvantaged families by giving women the vote and other rights, improving minority rights, providing free education and healthcare, and undercutting clerical power. Now, as great as these reforms sound on paper, in reality they were not particularly successful, and rather than create a new base of support for the autocracy, they served to solidify the opposition. The intelligentsia and the urban working class, still interested in the revolutionary ideas of the 50s, greatly expanded in size, but they lacked the trade unions and political parties to represent their views, except of course illegal underground parties who were dangerous to associate with. And the peasant class received few of the benefits that they were promised either. 68% of the population remained illiterate and healthcare was still substandard. Wealth and power remained in the hands of the bourgeoisie. The government became more corrupt. With the trade unions and opposition parties banned, the only significant force that was able to operate openly within Iran was the Shia clergy. Now, the land reforms also targeted the landholdings of the clergy in Iran, which of course is a material basis for the opposition to the Shah's policy, as much of the funding from the clergy came from the feudal exploitation of the peasantry. Also of concern to them was the cultural reforms, which removed much of their power over the running of society, which they did along strict religious lines in the field of family and law and things like that. The increasing secularism over education, politics, women's rights, etc., of course offended their fundamentalist sensibilities, and the reforms allowing religious minorities to hold office in government and as judges sent their anti-Semitic paranoia into overdrive, basically accusing the Shah of subverting Iran's Islam towards Jewish needs or some crap. Still, much of the clergy remained pretty quiet, the most outspoken opponent being Ruhollah Khomeini. Now, Ruhollah Khomeini was born in Khomein in Iran in 1902 and later became a Shia cleric, often giving lectures and producing writings on Islamic philosophy, law and ethics. He advocated religious involvement in politics at every level and in many ways was considered very radical by his peers. By 1963 he had risen high enough in the Shia clergy and began organising religious figures in denouncing the secularism of the Shah's autocracy. He gave a speech on the 3rd of June of that year, publicly railing against the Shah and accusing him of being an infidel. 2 days later he was arrested. Riots from his many supporters lasted for 3 days and resulted in over 400 deaths. However, Khomeini was eventually released in August. A year later, Khomeini clashed with the government again over allowing US military personnel to be extradited back to America for crimes they committed in Iran, which he called capitulation, and which resulted in Prime Minister Hassan Ali Mansour being assassinated for slapping Khomeini in the face. Now, Khomeini then went into a 14-year exile. He moved to Turkey, then he moved to Iraq, where he was forced to leave by Vice President Saddam Hussein, not the first conflict the two would have, before settling in France. From aboard, Khomeini became a figurehead of the opposition to the Shah, being made a Marja-e-Taqlid, or a model for imitation for many Shia Muslims, a title granted to very few people in the world. Over the next few years, Khomeini became the most influential revolutionary figure for Iranians. His books and tapes on Islamic governments devoured very eagerly by his increasingly massive following inside and outside of Iran. And a cult of personality was formed around the Ayatollah, and he benefited greatly from the mysticism around him. But let us pause here and ask ourselves, why is it that religious fundamentalism became the driving force behind the Iranian Revolution? And in my opinion, the following factors have played a key role. The crushing of the urban Marxist and trade union movements and suppression of the organised working class resulted in the majority peasant population having no movement to turn to connect to beyond kind of the rural guerrilla groups. Now, the intelligentsia had a reasonably strong Marxist current, as well as nationalist and liberal movements, but likely had very little connection outside of the cities. And as I mentioned, the working class had great difficulty organising along Marxist lines. Now, the clergy continued to play a key role in day-to-day life in the country, like in most Muslim countries. Religion was deeply interwoven into rural society, and unlike Christian societies, which for the most part have rid themselves of clerical control over social life, Islamic countries still retain social relations based greatly around religious principles. Certain qualities of Islamic law have strengthened its role in these social relations, which means breaking with them is a much more radical move than in the city, considering the secularism there and the more liberal atmosphere of the opposition circles compared to the conservatism of the country. Now, secularism is itself sometimes associated with imperialism in the Middle East. Considering the Shah's subservience to the West, secular society was seen, and in a view greatly encouraged by the clergy, as having been imposed by foreign powers, and of course all that is foreign is Zionist in the eyes of the pure logic of radical Islam. The Shah was therefore portrayed as trying to destroy Islam, i.e. society, in the eyes of the rural population in the name of Jewish imperialism. Now, while this held little water in the liberal and Marxist circles in the cities, to the illiterate peasantry and the clerics attempting to coerce them, this made perfect sense. Shall we compare this situation to Russia? Unlike the secular Shah of Iran, the Tsar of Russia based his autocracy around the idea that he was placed there by God, and the Church and its institutions wholeheartedly supported this, and it benefited greatly from it. The Church was thus seen as another vestige of exploitation by the peasant rebellion, and clerical property was fair game. To rebel against the Church was to rebel against the Tsar. The provisional government, still tied in many subtle ways to the old order, was essentially seen as a puppet of the Entente, and the remaining clergy as forces of reaction, as well as oppression for various minorities in the surrounding nations of the Russian Empire: Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, Tajiks, etc., etc. In rebelling against the secularism of the Shah, many felt they rebelled against the corruption of the monarchy and imperialist domination they were fighting, and they were fighting for the purity of religious rule and social justice. So just as Lenin and Bolshevism was seen as a symbol of revolution in Russia, so too were Khomeini and radical Shia Islam as a symbol of revolution in Iran. When the astoundingly huge revolution of 1979 finally came about, 10% of the population is said to have taken part in this revolution. The old regime crumbled away very quickly, and the Shah fled into exile, and Khomeini and his supporters quickly took power. The massive demonstrations, general strikes, and attacks from the Marxist guerrillas, whose numbers were briefly able to swell due to the sudden weakening of the state, swept quickly across the country, surprising and terrifying the West. While no doubt approving of the quick suppression of communist parties and trade unions, the West, Israel and their Sunni Muslim allies like Saudi Arabia were greatly alarmed by Khomeini's radical Shia internationalism. The Soviets, having degenerated by this point into social imperialism, had much to fear from radical Islam spreading to their own Muslim provinces too, as did their ally, the pseudo-fascist Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, with its long-suppressed Shia majority right next door to Iran. Now, Saddam was not short of friends when he decided to take advantage of what he perceived to be revolutionary turmoil in Iran to invade with the hopes of destroying the new regime and seizing the oil-rich province of Khuzestan, I think it is, for Iraq. And the radicalised population of Iran quickly rallied around Khomeini, soon pushing out the Iraqis and beginning their own counter-invasion, clearing the way for the execution of dissidents, Marxists, and the imposition of the most fundamentalist regime in the world, and solidifying the dictatorship of the clerics in the country. The Iran-Iraq War, one of the most disgustingly cynical conflicts in the world, is a subject for another video. But let me say this. There was no good, there was no evil. There was only money, from oil and from weapon sales, to both sides. The war, however, served a useful purpose for the Islamic regime, despite Khomeini having to drink the poison chalice, as he put it, and stop the pointless 6-year invasion of Iraq. His enemies were dead, and the regime was strong, and the people were isolated. I'm just going to stop this here and start in another video, so tune in for part 2.